Papers, and I'm joined by the writer and academic Mo Lovett and Nigel Nelson, the Sunday Mirror's political editor. Good to see you both. Thanks for joining us. Well, obviously, one story in town today leading the front pages. Mo, let's begin with you with the front page of The Observer. Top Tories say Boris Johnson's return would risk the party's death. What more can you tell us on that?
Yeah, so the story is that senior Tories are engaged in a sort of frontline battle to prevent Boris Johnson's return to number 10 because they fear it'll risk tearing the party apart and it'll be the sort of end of the Conservative Party, I guess. And what I would say about this is that sort of mirrors a lot of what I heard coming out of Tory party conference, that the party is sort of split really, or it's at least pulling itself in two directions. On the one hand, it's the kind of free marketeers, the kind of fiscal responsibility Tories who would be more likely to support Rishi Sunak. And then there are others who prefer more state intervention, the levelling up agenda of Boris Johnson. So it does feel like there's this real tension at the heart of the Tory party at the moment. I mean, what I would say is that the Conservatives have always been very, very good at putting party first. And they tend to rally round and unify when they really need to. You only have to look back to the 2019 Euro elections where the Tory party, I think, came last, didn't they? They were pretty much wiped out by those elections, and yet they rallied around Boris Johnson and that Brexit vote and pulled themselves together and remained in power. So that is something that the Conservative Party is very good at. I mean, I think, obviously, we're talking about these two rival campaigns, Sunak campaign and Johnson campaign. It's worth remembering neither have declared yet. But certainly, I think some senior figures, Alok Sharma, Steve Barclay, Lord Frost, Steve Barclay, and perhaps most devastatingly, Kemi Badenoch, who is a big supporter of Boris. They've all rallied around Rishi Sunak, with Kemi Badenoch saying, this isn't a popularity contest. And I think a sort of veiled threat at Boris Johnson there, but it also reveals the fact that Johnson's still incredibly popular with the wider general public and a lot of the membership. So really, I think it is the backbenchers and some of those senior Tories that really are rooting for Sunak. So we'll see what the future has to come. We'll know more tomorrow.
Yeah, certainly, Mo, as you say, Boris Johnson does still have significant popularity among the public, but certainly high-profile endorsements for Rishi Sunak, perhaps deemed as a much lower risk option. And of course, Nigel, there's that parliamentary standards investigation still hanging over Boris Johnson, and reports that he held talks last night with Rishi Sunak, that on the front page of The Telegraph. What more do we know about what may have been discussed?
Well, they're not saying that. Obviously, there were peace talks to try and bury the hatchet between them. And the idea is that if it's at all possible that Monday will be a coronation of the new leader and prime minister, rather than letting the vote go to party members and the whole thing dragging on till Friday. Hard to see, though, what these sort of peace talks could have achieved, because if Rishi was to be Prime Minister, what does Boris Johnson get? Does he become Foreign Secretary again? And would he want that on the basis that he's already been Prime Minister, he's done the Foreign Secretary's job? It's hard to see him wanting to actually go back to that. On the other hand, if Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister again, and Rishi Sunak's obvious job would be Chancellor, well, that was the primary reason that Rishi Sunak resigned in the first place, because of economic differences with Boris Johnson. So the idea that there's some kind of rapprochement between the two of them sounds really a bit unlikely. And obviously the question comes down to Rishi Sunak knows that if Boris Johnson can get the 100 MP nominations he needs, that it's quite likely that the party membership, the 172,000 members, will turn around and bring Boris Johnson in. So it's a very tricky one. Rishi Sunak doesn't want it to go to the membership. Boris Johnson does. The idea of a peace deal between them looks a bit far away.
It's certainly, Nigel, The Telegraph is reporting that the talks were held to potentially agree a joint ticket, but it's very hard to see how either candidate would want anything but the top job.
Well, exactly, and that's why I think the joint ticket is bitterness between the two men because it was really Rishi Sunak resigning which brought Boris Johnson down. Rishi Sunak went, and not long afterwards another 59 ministers also quit. So it's very difficult to see how they can actually come to any kind of deal. I suppose what is absolutely astonishing is the mere fact that we might have Boris Johnson back again as a kind of second Berlusconi, that he would actually get back into number 10. But that is looking increasingly likely at the moment.
It certainly is, and it would be an astonishing comeback, as you say, Nigel. Mo, the Sunday Times, obviously leading on the same story, but also an interesting story underneath on their front page about oil activists being paid to protest, of course, and that comes after the recent Home Secretary, Suella Braverman's recent announcement about trying to crack down on these protesters.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the revelation that the Just Stop Oil campaign pays its activists to protest. Most interestingly, using donations from a fund that is backed by the granddaughter of John Paul Getty, of the oil industry fame. So I think that's quite interesting. It's called the Climate Emergency Fund, and they give $1.1 million to the climate activists. And it's used for things like travel to events, for venue booking, for banners and flyers and all the rest of it. Now, on the one hand, I think there's sort of nothing wrong with that. What would you use the donation for if it wasn't to support your campaign? I think Suella Braverman's wrong. I think the right to protest is a very important part of our democracy. But in terms of this particular protest, I think it won't do any good for the activists to be seen. They've already got sort of an image of trust fund babies protesting, where workers are trying to get to work and people are trying to go about their everyday lives. So I don't think it'll enhance their reputation. The other thing I think is environmentalist campaigners are very quick to say that things like art institutions shouldn't be funded by Shell and BP. They shouldn't take that kind of money to do their work. So again, I don't agree with that. I think money can be used for good purposes, but it just shows some of the hypocrisy and perhaps that failure to win the battle of ideas in the public that some of these protests have. So not a good look for them, although technically I think they've actually done nothing wrong.
And on to the front page of the Sunday Mirror, Nigel. Of course, your paper, the splash, the Tories can't even govern themselves. That quote from Sir Keir Starmer. Tell us more.
Yeah, Keir Starmer is arguing that what we should be having is a general election, and I think he's absolutely right. This is an extraordinary way of actually running a democracy at the moment. What we're talking about is 356 voters tomorrow deciding who our next Prime Minister is. Now, if they can't make up their minds, that then goes to 172,000 Conservative members, and they only represent 0.4% of the electorate. So it does seem extraordinary. It's perfectly constitutional, but it does seem extraordinary that we seem to be electing our next Prime Minister in much the same way as the old Soviet Politburo used to elect their leaders. And it just isn't democratic. Now, quite clearly, the last thing the Tories want is a general election. They would be nearly wiped out. The latest polls say they become a rump of about 48 MPs, down from 365 in 2019, and they wouldn't even be the official opposition. The SNP would actually take that over. So you can see they don't want an election, but really, democracy and the indication from the polls that people want change really does demand one.
And certainly it's very interesting that in that article there, you talk about how Boris Johnson claims to have those 100 backers. Of course, that's the number that they would both need to secure the first round tomorrow. But certainly publicly, he's very far off that number at the moment, raising questions about whether he indeed has them. Certainly more may materialise in the coming hours. But for now, thanks to you both, and we'll see you next hour. Thank you. And that is still to come on Sky News Breakfast. Far more on the Tory leadership race, which could be decided as soon as tomorrow.